many sessions, made a terrible mistake and gave the job to me. But I do want you to know that Stan also is the author of this. And if you people that have read it know that he writes magnificent, just magnificent the way this man writes. He speaks lousy, but he writes great. So we're going to, I'm not going to spend any more time because I want Stan to have as much time as he needs. So without further ado, Stanley Day.
Good evening, friends. My name is Stanley Day, and I am an alcoholic. And thank you, Bob, for those kind words. I'll reciprocate one of these times. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. It's a privilege to be here. And it's a wonderful feeling to me to be here, because I've invested a pretty good portion of my life in this kind of work. And this has certainly got to be the greatest satisfaction that anybody can have, to walk into an audience like this and see the people who are sitting here and drinking in the wonderful rewards of sobriety and realizing the impact this has not only on the alcoholic, but on the family of the alcoholic, the children of the alcoholic, the wife of the alcoholic, the employer of the alcoholic, and of course on the alcoholic himself, which I speak for because I am a recovering alcoholic. It was not ever thus. We didn't always have a program for alcoholic recovery. We were not making a dent in this nation on the stigma of alcoholism. But that's not really remarkable, and it's not really an insult to our society or to our times that we didn't do much for the alcoholic. Recently, in the Far East, they unearthed a document made of pottery that was over 6,000 years old. And they took much time deciphering it. And this is one of the oldest known pieces of manuscript that was put on pottery 6,000 years ago. It was a recipe for making beer. So you see, we really have carried this burden a long time. I'm sure that if we go back far enough, you'll find people swinging from trees. They fell into a fermented pond, they liked what they found down there, and they kept going back to that pond, especially if they were alcoholics. I have seen so many tragedies associated with alcoholism in my personal life and in my public life, that the longer I live, the more I realize that everything else is very small, including war. We talk about the millions of people that are impacted by war. We talk about the racial disturbances in Germany and the extermination of 6 million Jews. We talk about the extermination of 12 million Russians during that same war. We talk about our own boys who were lost overseas during the war. And if we added that against what the toll is in alcoholism, I'm sure that we'd find out that alcoholism is by far the greater killer. Because we don't only contribute to death by alcoholism, we contribute to the death of others by alcoholism. We contribute to the ruined ways of life and the national asset because of alcoholism. And we cause death and desolation wherever we walk in the name of alcoholism. We're not very pretty people. We're not very pretty people, but then of course the lepers weren't very pretty people either when they walked the face of the earth for many years and were shunned by society. And they bore a stigma like the alcoholics. Everybody pointed a finger at them and said, that's it. You're a moral degenerate, you're a disease degenerate, you're this and you're that. And for many generations we've borne very well under the stigma that we were moral degenerates. This was my opinion of alcoholism when I first came into contact with it at the ripe age of about 6 years old. When my father, who had never taken a drink in his life, who was 35 years of age, had come and had emigrated from Norway, at one time had been one of the wealthiest men in Norway before he bet on Germany in World War I, spoke 6 or 7 languages very fluently, and was an intellectual giant, came to this country, and we moved into a little community in California, up in El Cerrito, right outside of Oakland, which was all Scandinavian and Italians. And that was all we had, and everybody was busy partying all the time. My father would never drink. He was the party pooper. And finally my mother talked him into taking a drink, and he was a primary alcoholic. And from that day to the day that he died in the institution after 3 years with a wet brain, my father was incapable of attaining and maintaining sobriety. And it wasn't because of a moral degeneracy. He was probably the most moral man I ever met. So I was a rather confused individual when I first had my tryout in the athletic field of alcoholism. To get away from alcoholism in the days of the Depression in 1936, to escape from this terrible lack of communication with my father, the lack of love, the resentments and the hate that I felt against him whenever he partook of alcohol, I decided to get away from it by joining the Navy. I joined the Navy, and I went over to Pearl Harbor. I went on the old pig boats, the old submarines that you could stick your finger in if you wanted to, and it'd go right out the other end. They too were left over from World War I, and they were pretty dirty and pretty messy, and these were the days from here to eternity that Jones wrote so well about. The whole pattern of living for the military, we only had 75,000 people in the entire Navy, the whole living pattern in the islands was one of promiscuity and much drinking, and for the first 6 months I drank not at all. And finally they took me ashore to initiate me into the great art of drinking and to celebrate the day that I put my dolphins on. And that day I had my first rum and Coca-Cola, and I loved it. I grew 10 foot tall, and the world suddenly started to pay off all the dividends that it owed me. I had a wonderful personality. I was suddenly a very successful little sailor in his white uniform. And everything was mine, including the woman that I was madly chasing up and down the bar by the time I'd had 4 or 5 drinks. And 2 hours later, I went into my first blackout. I'm not going to give you a drunk log, I'm just going to tell you the impact of a primary alcoholic and what alcohol will do to you. This was my first time. This was on a Saturday, and by Sunday I had been in and out of a blackout. And when I was in, I was only in long enough to find another drink, and then I went back out into my blackout, which was, of course, pure alcohol amnesia. Never in my life was I to know what I'd done during those particular hours. They grew longer as my drinking did. On Monday morning, I woke up, and in Honolulu in those days, we had mostly cane fields. We didn't have hotels. In fact, we only had 2 down there, the Royal Hawaiian and the Moana. And most of it was cane fields, and the cane fields get awful hot in the daytime. And the heat is concentrated by the sugar cane down near the ground. And it forms a rain all of its own, and it's on this nice red dirt, red clay. And I was in my little white uniform, and I woke up laying there in this mire of mud and clay, sick unto death. And I looked up, and in those days we didn't burn the cane patches off. The Japanese workers were there with their huge machetes. And I looked up, and there were 6 Japanese watching me with these huge machetes. And I sobered up all of a sudden. And I got up and I got running. I came back to my submarine, and my commanding officer had compassion on me and talked to my youth and inexperience and let me go. And for the next 2 years of my life, I used that youth and inexperience as an excuse many, many times. Finally, it didn't work, and I ended up getting a court-martial. Now, I didn't want to be a drunk, and I didn't want to be a failure, and I didn't want to be a fool. I wanted to be an achiever. I wanted to do things in my life. I wanted to reach heights materially because I had been a child of the Depression, and I certainly wanted security. And I knew that as long as I had this problem with booze, I had insecurity. I had a terrible fear that I would go into the life and end up in the Embarcadero in San Francisco about 1 month after I got out of the Navy. And I tried very, very much to discipline myself by becoming a periodic drunk. And I could go a month, and I could go 2 months. But sooner or later, I would take that drink, and once I took that drink of alcohol, my behavior pattern became unpredictable. I didn't know whether I was going to be a lover or a fighter or what I was going to do. And as a consequence, I just got deeper and deeper into my alcoholism. I finally realized that the only hope that I had was to mark time. And as a consequence, I stayed out in the Pacific Ocean areas until 1947. I stayed out there 11 years, and through 2 wars. I went back out there for the Korean War. And all the time I was looking for my answer to this alcoholism paradox that I seem to be involved in. I was probably the first sailor in the Pacific Fleet that was ever sent out to the Philippines as a non-volunteer. In those days you used to have to volunteer to go into the Asiatic Fleet. But by this time I had screwed up the Pacific Fleet so much they decided they had to move me out a little bit. And one day my commanding officer finally informed me he was going to send me out to the Philippines, and he did. And I got out there just before Pearl Harbor. Well, Pearl Harbor came along, and of course I was in radio station Cavite. They bombed out the radio station. They bombed out the San Miguel beer factory. Geneva gin was gone. We had nothing to drink. And the more that we lost our liquor supply, the more thirsty we became. And being good alcoholics, though we didn't call ourselves alcoholics in that particular day, we finally congregated down in the Navy Yard, 21 of us drunks, and we sat around trying to figure out what to do, whether we wanted to go to Corrigan or Bataan or what we wanted to do, join the Army. Well, at that particular time in military history, the Navy didn't care much for going and working with the Army. And so we decided to go to the hills and pass ourselves from one village to the other, knowing that they had the 2 great needs of all human beings. They had plenty of women up there and plenty of booze. And we didn't really care if the war ever ended then. So we'd made up our mind to take to the hills, and that night a young officer came by and said, "We're looking for volunteers." Well, we had all been in the Navy long enough to know that, you really don't volunteer for anything. And we looked out in the Manila Bay, and there was a 13,000-ton French ship called the Marshal Joffre. It was still in the hands of the Vichy French. It was a big old diesel burner, square stacks, and we knew that if perchance any way we could get a hold of that ship and take it out to harbor, we had the Japanese fleet landing at the end of the harbor anyway, so we'd never get by there. But if you did get by, you had the whole Japanese submarine fleet needing diesel oil, and they would be chasing us all over the ocean. So we told him we weren't a bit interested in this, and he left, and pretty soon we have the greatest communication system outside of AA and outside of the alcoholic fraternity in the Navy. And we soon had the scuttlebutt that this ship had just come in with 600 passengers and 300 crew members. She came in from Shanghai. She was going to Vietnam, and from Vietnam she was going to Marseille, France. And she had put enough booze on her in Shanghai to last all the way. So the next day we went up and took her over. We put the 600 people in the internment camp. We got 60 Frenchmen and 40 Chinamen to agree to help us take it out. And then we stayed drunk for 2 weeks trying to figure out how to get the ship out of the harbor. Well, finally, in one of our drunken flashes, we decided we really were more scared of the submarines than we were of their fleet. So we built a wooden gun forward and a wooden gun aft, like a 6-inch gun. We covered it with canvas. We put an E for efficiency and lots of hash marks on it. And one night when we had a little storm come in, we all got drunk and took it out. We had orders to proceed to any port in the world. And as everything was in French and we didn't understand French, that's exactly where we headed, any port in the world. The Japanese chased us all over the China Seas. And they knew where we were, but we didn't know where we were. Finally, we found Australia, and I thought that was quite an accomplishment. It's a pretty good-sized continent, but when you're roaming around out there, it was amazing we found anything. We found Darwin, Australia, which is up in the northwest corner of Australia. A very primitive village, and we tied up that night in the middle of the stream, and Tokyo Rose was claiming they were going to get us. They had got us, and they had damaged us and all this thing, and they hadn't really. We'd hardly diminished our liquor supply, so we still felt pretty good. Well, that night, one of our men on the anchor watch got a little drunk and stumbled and fell and grabbed a hold of one of the pins and slipped the anchor chain. And we found ourselves, after a couple of hours, gliding down the other end of the bay. Finally got another anchor out and stayed there that night. During the night, the U.S. Army transport MiGs came in with troops probably from Hawaii, and they stationed her to put her anchor down exactly where we had just left. And that day, the next day, the Japanese came in for the first and only time and bombed Australia. And they sank the Army transport MiGs. So drinking has played a big role in my life and has saved it a few times. But in alcoholism and in life and in war, you always get the rewards too. When we finally made it down to Sydney, Australia, after many, many more drunken and hilarious and narrow escapes and being torpedoed and everything else, we finally made it into Sydney, Australia. And 8 of us rode into the man-of-war steps to go report to the naval attaché that we had made it. And we got into the man-of-war steps, and there were 10,000 women standing there to greet us. We were the first American sailors to come into Australia, and all of the Australian soldiers were up in North Africa fighting the Desert Fox. So we had Sydney, Australia. There was a compensation for that. But alcohol, other than that thing, played a very, very small part in my rest of the war, because I kept myself pretty much in the war zone looking for an answer. What is this answer that after I take a few drinks of alcohol, I become absolutely irresponsible, unpredictable, insane, and how can I get it under control? Well, I thought maybe I was stupid. I studied law, I studied CPA, I studied journalism. I wrote magazine articles for Coronet and Red Book and some of the others. But no matter what I did or what I achieved, it was always the same thing. When I took a drink of alcohol, I was in a problem. So I stayed out there till 1947 looking for an answer, and I found no answer. I came back to the United States. I went down real fast. I was in the military, and I soon asked for overseas duty again because I could not get control of my drinking. I still was in the state of mind that I didn't want to be a drunk. I didn't want to be a bum. I didn't want to hurt my parents. I didn't want to hurt people who I loved. And when I got married, I didn't want to hurt my wife. I didn't want to destroy myself and make my whole life nothing but a nonentity, a reason for not existing at all. But I found no answer. I went to chaplains, I went to legal officers, I went to judges, I went to everybody, but not once. In all that time, anybody ever mentioned Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's not really amazing. Even today, I run across a lot of people who don't know about Alcoholics Anonymous. They don't know about their effectiveness. And so finally, I came back to the United States and settled down in Washington, D.C. I was on Admiral Radford's staff, and he brought me back. And my wife and I tried desperately to find an answer to my drinking for 2 years. And all happened was, of course, it got worse. One day, one of my neighbors who got tired of me beating on his door and asking for $20 to last till the next morning told my wife about Alcoholics Anonymous. That was a little bit over 23 years ago. I went into that place. I went into Alcoholics Anonymous, and I found people like you. People who had been there, who couldn't con me, and I couldn't con them. People who understood me and were not asking great things of me. People who taught me how to live. People who told me things that I had never known before, never appreciated before, and I just followed in their footsteps, and somehow or another, sobriety kept accumulating, and I started finding a whole new way of life. I left the Navy, and I went into the government. I worked very actively in Alcoholics Anonymous because, to me, there was a tremendous pity that we had so many people suffering from a very apparent disease and who were completely unable by themselves to attain and maintain sobriety. And finally, I wandered over to the Postal Service to work for General Gnoski. And in evaluating the Postal Service, it was not too difficult after going on the workroom floor, on Turb 1 especially, or going out on the platform. It wasn't too difficult to see we had a booze problem out there someplace, and we did have a couple of drunks. And at this time, I got concerned enough to start working on the program that eventually became PAR. I went to civil service. They had nothing. I went to industry. I went to DuPont. I went to a lot of, but they didn't have programs that would fit in with us. When DuPont started their program, they started it for their executives. They didn't start it for their craft employees or anything else. To them, their big investments were in their specialists and their chemists and so forth. So I couldn't find anything that really fit, and I went up to Bill Wilson and asked him what in the world we could do to start a program in the federal government that would be reaching the people. He says, don't copy anybody, just go on back and lay it out the way you really believe, and the knowledge that you have of civil service. He says, it'll work. And so I went back and I designed a program that I felt would work, which is pretty much the PAR prototype. And I took it back up to Bill, and he changed about 2 words in the whole thing, and I came back and I said, now I got a beautiful package, and I went up to Gronowski, and he says, I'm not interested. So then I started my campaign back there, and I was a director of review and analysis, so I had them as my audience once a month, whether they liked it or not, and I kept on pounding on alcoholism, and I ran into deep ears because half of them were bombed all the time anyway. And then we got O'Brien, and I says, hey, boy, with O'Brien here, an Irishman from up there, he's got to understand alcoholism. And he did. And he was ready to let us go ahead and start the program. And suddenly up in Chicago, we had about 300 trucks full of mail. Some of them were dumped and some of it was burnt. And we made all of the newspapers, and he called me and he says, I'm very sorry. With that kind of publicity, we don't need it, and we better forget all about it. He says, I can't go into a cabinet member, I guess a cabinet member can't go into the president and say, you know, I'm going to start a program for drunks, and they'll all say, yeah, I know, that's why we never get our mail. So he says, I can't do that. So it was a pretty futile and thing, and I threw that PAR thing in the desk many a time and said, no way will we ever get this program. In November 1968, we finally got permission to start it in San Francisco. The man who is now the Deputy Postmaster General, Conway, was the inspector on the West Coast, and he was one of the first people that I had to brief. And Conway was our absolute first supporter from the West Coast. He believed in the program. He offered me everything from his inspecting services to follow the drunks around or anything else I wanted. And he couldn't believe that we could possibly have a program that people would voluntarily walk in and actually do something about their drinking habit. Showed me magnificent pictures of the locker raids they had made and all the booze they located. And I had already in Washington had the postmaster in Washington pick up the empties in the Washington post office for 1 year. And we picked up 50,000 empty bottles in 1 year. So it's a pretty good business to have a bar right next to a post office. Anyway, we had Conway and we had Limpy Lee, and Limpy Lee is still the postmaster up in San Francisco. He's still a very ardent supporter of us, and he is quite a guy. Well, eventually, after that program got to producing, after it was structured so we could prove by cost benefit that we were making money, that it wasn't just a losing proposition, it wasn't a giveaway, that one, we had identified alcoholics, and two, that alcoholics could be helped and they could recover. We start getting more acceptance, and about the time we got the acceptance, we also got a new administration. We had to start all over again. We had to indoctrinate Postmaster General Blunt and Ken Hausman, who was the APMG for personnel. And they believed that we did not need recovered alcoholics. All we had to do was get a personnel man in there for a couple hours a day and a chaplain, and the rest of it would take care of itself, because he'd put a program like this in Union Carbide. So we had a confrontation, and he told me to close down the San Francisco program. And I just forgot to call up Betty Edwards and tell her to close it down, so therefore she just kept on operating. Finally, they needed me in personnel because we had a Postal Street Academy program, which was their favorite program. This was dealing with the inner city dropouts. And in return for my working on that program, why they would give us a go-ahead to put the PAR program into Chicago and into the Boston facilities. We went into Boston, and our now Bill Bolger, our Postmaster General, was there. And from the time that we gave him the first briefing until the day I got the letter from him a couple of days ago, that man has been our 100% backer of the PAR program. Just to give you an insight on how the Postmaster General feels about this, when he took over his office as Postmaster General just recently, Lev Baylor, he called in all his top people, all his APMGs, and he went over all of his programs, his equal opportunity programs, his affirmative action programs, everything else, and they discussed it thoroughly up there, all the ins and all the outs and what they were going to do. And then he finally got to the PAR program. And he said, gentlemen, he says, let me give you my feelings on PAR. He says, I completely and absolutely support PAR. He said, I understand there are some of you in this room who are opposed to PAR. He says, well, I'm Postmaster General. You better never bring that out in the open. And that's all he said about PAR, and somehow or another they had no more discussion on PAR. That doesn't mean that everybody loves us in Washington, but I can assure you that the Postmaster General and the Deputy Postmaster General certainly do, and they understand us and understand us well. The unions have been beautiful. This article, this publication was put out by the American Postal Workers Union. The APW under Philby did a lot of pioneering work in alcoholism. We had alcoholism representatives from the APW over in Bangkok and the International Council on Alcoholism over there. He became a member. We got Philby to be a member of the Labor Management Committee of the National Council on Alcoholism, and we got Baylor to be a member of the Board of Directors of the National Council on Alcoholism. As a consequence, they are very, very closely identified with the alcoholism effort in the Postal Service. Joe Vaca, when he took over as the president of the National Association of Letter Carriers, called me into Washington, wanted me to write an article for him to put in the magazine, which he did. And at that time, he gave me some real good background history on himself. At one time, Joe Vaca was working in the Cleveland Post Office with Emmett Cooper. And Emmett Cooper is now the Regional Postmaster General in the Eastern Region. Emmett had the personnel office and Joe had the carriers. And whenever they would find a drunk, and they found plenty of them, they wouldn't take disciplinary actions. They'd both scare the hell out of them, and then they'd send them over to AA. So we never really had any big problem in getting a program going in Cleveland because we've had that kind of support. So now we are very fortunate. We've got the presidents of the unions, we've got their top staff, we've got Lorenzo Stevens at the APWU, we've got John Dubay, we've got Frosty Newman, who is a recovered alcoholic, and I can break his anonymity because I can never shut him up about it anyway, so I might just as well break it. But Frosty is now the Director of Labor Relations for the APWU and has done us a tremendous amount of good in the PAR program. Now recently, the unions are getting ready, and last Thursday they started their negotiations with management on the entire contract. And I would like to take a few minutes. I know there's some of you who might not be really interested in the contract. There's some people I recognize who have retired from the Postal Service. But even so, it is a matter of concern on the PAR program, and I will tell you some of the stuff that we've been doing in the forthcoming negotiations on PAR and Article 35. They asked me to write up some stuff on it for inclusion in the negotiations. I think most of you are familiar with what we have in Article 35 now, which pretty much puts management and labor on a position that they have to support this program, and there's no way that they can possibly cut it out. But there has been many holes appearing in PAR. I think I said that well, didn't I? Holes. There are many holes appearing in PAR in the last few years, and we have not been able to repair all of them because of the opposition we've had in some members of the staff in Washington. And another reason has been the lack of understanding of a lot of people in the field, a lot of people at many levels in the field, from postmasters to regional officials. As a result, the only kind thing I can say is that in some areas PAR has been bastardized. There are people who would like to see us liquidated over the period of the next few years.